Max, my love. Yes, Max is a chimpanzee, and he's in love with Charlotte Rampling's character, Margaret Jones, who is not a chimpanzee, but nonetheless, she loves him too. Where do we start with this movie? Well, it's directed by Nagisa Oshima, who is one of my favorite directors, I think. Certainly, he's an interesting and a confounding director, and I can tell you right now that Max, my love, definitely does not have the same kind of intensity as the three Oshima movies that we've covered on the channel previously. Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, In the Realm of the Senses, and The Ceremony. 3 amazing movies. Yeah, this one doesn't quite have the potency or the intensity, but you can see Oshima's fingerprints all over it. We'll talk about that in a second. Max, my love, is rated 6.0 on IMDb, and on some level, it's not hard to see why. This movie is hard to swallow, without a doubt, but that is probably part of its charm, and personally, I would recommend it, maybe, as long as you're not allergic to the preposterous. Maybe you even enjoy the preposterous. Who knows? Before we get into some of the ideas in the movie, let me give you a better sense of what it's really like, because, yeah, you're not exactly going to know what to expect when you hear what this movie is about. First of all, I want to reassure you that I haven't spoiled anything. This movie has a pretty fast start, and it doesn't waste much time getting to the chimpanzee. I thought we might spend a while wondering, what is Margaret up to? But the movie actually starts strong with some instant drama. Margaret's husband, Peter, is on the phone to a friend, one of Margaret's friends, and he asks, hey, is Margaret there? And she says no, but moments later, Margaret walks in the door. Peter says, well, where were you at? And she said, I was with my friend. Peter, by the way, through this episode, is cleaning his gun. So some instant drama, perhaps. Peter figures out about the chimpanzee about 5 minutes later, and most of the movie is actually about the chimp coming to live with the family. If this movie were about a dog and there were no sex involved, it would probably read like a family movie, almost a Hallmark movie about, adopting Lassie or something. Oshima, of course, is no stranger to mixing genres and playing off of them. All of his movies are a little hard to pin down, at least the ones I've seen. When I say a little hard to pin down, I mean impossible to pin down, but this one is probably the most extreme in that regard. I can't tell you what genre this movie is. I can't tell you if it's a comedy. I found some parts of it to be hilarious. The initial reveal of the chimpanzee is hysterical, but the movie kind of confronts its most strange aspects, or at least it reveals them early on. It's kind of like, hey, yeah, it's a chimp, get over it, right? And it's fairly serious in a lot of places, at least until Margaret is talking to Peter on the phone, and she asks him to put Max on, and he does it. This is a funny movie. I mean, there's no way around that. And without a doubt, Oshima knew what he was doing here. But as usual, he's not really following generic conventions. You wouldn't exactly say it's a comedy, even though it is extremely funny. I don't know. Does that make sense? The movie mostly takes place in a nice Parisian apartment. It's mainly tracing the politics of a family and the society around them, the immediate society around them, using an extreme, almost metaphorical element to tease out some unspoken ideas and emotions. And in that way, it's not too different from most of Oshima's movies. Actually, as strange as this movie might seem, there are a number of other things we could compare it to. Beyond the works of Oshima, there's a lot of movies about characters that turn into animals, like Cat People. I have a video about that one, of course, about the new one, the 80s one. The Outer Limits, there's another one. That's a really cool movie. These films about the transformation between sort of a human and something more like visceral and animalistic, in particular, an animal, are kind of similar to this. Both of those movies are also libidinal, which this movie absolutely is. So there's other stuff that resonates. Much less obvious of a comparison is to Fassbender's Ali Fear Eats the Soul. I'll come back to that in a second, but I think, there's something going on there too. The style of Max, My Love is admittedly slightly disappointing. Every other Oshima film I've seen is a feat of cinematography, and although this one is shot by the legend Raoul Coutard, who was very involved in the new wave and just filmed a gazillion cool movies over the years, it's not actually very interesting to look at. We don't have Oshima's iconic low-light photography, unfortunately, and maybe it actually looks a little cheap. The music in this movie is a little more subtle than most Oshima films, but I like it. A lot of the movie has no music at all, which pushes it a little bit towards the serious social drama side of things. But there's a couple nice musical motifs. One of the pieces reminds me a lot of the song Oh Superman by Laurie Anderson, if you can call that a song. Great piece of music. That's from 1981, I think, before this movie. I'm not saying they ripped it off. Just an interesting coincidence. I should note that this movie is both in English and French. I guess this adds something, but you do end up going back and forth from the subtitles quite a bit. Charlotte Rampling is British, of course. I forget that sometimes, given how many cool European movies she has been in. You have to commend her for appearing in some really interesting stuff like this, or The Damned, or The Night Porter. Charlotte Rampling has continued to work and has a massive career. She's pretty good in this movie, although acting kind of isn't at the center of it in some ways. She has a very ornate wardrobe, though, that cuts an interesting balance between something pretty 80s and something more classic. Sadly, the chimpanzee is not real. It's a woman named Elsa Burke in a costume, not credited in the movie, interestingly. The credits in this film are pretty cool, like Saul Bass-style credit sequence, kind of at odds with the time and place of the movie, but again, Oshima does not care about genre at all. The chimpanzee, the costume, it's relatively convincing, I guess. Maybe if you're really looking for it and you're not on board with it from the beginning, it could get under your skin. But I actually didn't realize that it was a costume at first. I thought, dang, Charlotte Rampling's pretty close to that wild beast. How did they do this? But you will realize, but I think it works more or less. The movie was written by Jean-Claude Carrière alongside Nagisa Oshima. Carrière has written a lot of cool movies, a lot of surreal stuff like The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie. And his history there maybe sheds a little light on the concept of this movie. Maybe makes a little more sense once you see some of the other stuff that he has put together. We've covered 2 other movies of his on this channel, The Tin Drum, which is amazing, and what's that? The Unbearable Lightness of Being, which, not really a fan of. The last logistical thing I want to mention is about a big elephant in the movie. I don't mean a literal one, although it wouldn't be inconceivable to find that in this movie. From the moment that Peter discovers that his wife is in a relationship with a chimpanzee, that she's having an affair with a chimp, he wants to know how they have sex. And the audience might be wondering the same thing. This is an interesting question for the movie. How are you going to answer this? You going to show this? I'm not going to spoil anything here, but I'll just say that it ends up being a little bit of a dramatic linchpin of the film, actually. Peter wants to know. Margaret doesn't want to tell him. It's kind of a private thing. This probably factors into some of the themes that we'll talk about in a second, but I'm not sure the balance is totally right. Maybe it's a little bit of a stumbling block for the movie, even though they kind of repurpose it into the plot a little bit. When I reviewed The Ceremony a couple of weeks ago, I made a big deal about the literal story and something more abstract on top of that, some spiritual ideas in the movie. This film is not as potent as that one, so I'm just going to talk about it in terms of themes. There is some subtle stuff happening here, though, and some of it is not totally easy to put your finger on, but it doesn't quite create the same Oshima effect, the same magic that you get in the other 3 movies. Well, let's talk about the 3 characters individually. They both, I think, shed light on different themes. First, there's Margaret, and she's got a pretty luxurious life, a nice wardrobe, but she's yearning for something more, you suppose. Peter is always asking her, why'd you do it? You know, what's the root of the affair? And she never really explains anything. And it's the way that she doesn't explain it is potent. I mean, again, it's something a little hard to put your finger on it, but the way that she doesn't really have an explanation is interesting, and it says a lot in some ways, explains a lot in some ways. You can get a sense. You know, when Peter discovers the chimp, he says that, well, let's all move in together. And Margaret doesn't want to do that. She's been renting an apartment for the chimp. I'm not sure that would work very well in practice. And it seems like she appreciates having this relationship of her own, having a space of her own. There's a little story about freedom here, a little story about a woman living in a relatively upper-class life, but not having a certain type of freedom or not being able to express herself in a way. Of course, Peter also has a mistress, and you don't feel quite as rosy about this. Peter, of course, sees the monkey as an affront to his sexuality. Peter works as a diplomat. He spends most of the movie trying to set up a visit from the Queen, which is sort of an interesting little detail. He's very used to smoothing things over as a diplomat. He has a certain type of refinement, but I guess he's unable to please his wife. In the presence of this virile animal in his house, it gives him a lot to think about, and it cracks open a lot of feelings surrounding masculinity. Like I said, Peter suggests that the chimp should move in. That's a diplomatic sacrifice, the respectable thing to do, maybe a European thing to do, maybe. But perhaps it's the opposite of what the chimpanzee would do, right? interesting. So he struggles to reconcile his life with the chimp's life quite a bit. Finally, when it comes to Max, I want to point out some racial undertones in the movie before Peter sees that he's a chimp. When he first confronts Margaret in her apartment with her lover, he quietly asks her, "Where's he from?" Right? Almost as if assuming that he's some sort of foreigner. Now, granted, this is after he said something to the chimp and he hasn't responded, so maybe he has some reason to assume that he wouldn't speak this language, but from very early on, we're sort of... there's this question of an outsider, right? Not just a chimpanzee. Well, obviously, a chimpanzee is an outsider in the family, but there's also the sense of kind of a racial or a national outsider and how that plays out. This chimpanzee foreigner thing, it can be a dicey metaphor, of course, but it is maybe a good way to undermine the upper class society and see this narrative of like, okay, bringing the chimp into the house. The chimp's going to meet the friends. The chimp, what's the maid going to say about the chimp? All this stuff. It reminds me a little bit of a Michael Haneke movie. One of his specialties is looking at these kind of European upper middle class households and the cracks that sort of form beneath them. This is sort of an extreme version of those things, although Haneke himself is no stranger to extreme movies. Anyway, I'm not going to spend too much time pulling this movie apart. I think all these things that I just mentioned, I mean, they're in there, and it goes a little bit beyond words. There is some subtlety in this movie, despite a premise which is not subtle at all. As preposterous as things are, it does have some of the Oshima magic. A little bit of it, at least. A little bit of something unspoken. And some moments that are actually kind of moving as well. And it leaves you on a really interesting tone. The movie has moments that seem cheesy. Like right before the end, it seems like, whoa, is this how the movie's going to end? But Oshima kind of swerves at the last second. Yeah, he pulls the movie towards being a family kind of movie at times or being a comedy at times, but there's obviously some other stuff going on here too. Oshima is really crafty. This movie ends up not having the same kind of bite that most of his movies do. But look, I mean, I think it's just a lighter movie. Nothing wrong with that. But maybe for a lot of viewers, the sort of intensity and the bite of those other movies is part of what kind of makes it work. And without a doubt, this movie doesn't have that quite as much. And just the premise itself, although, you know, it's obviously kind of the point of the movie, is probably a stumbling block for a lot of viewers. So there's interesting stuff here. Not as potent as some of his other stuff. The themes, maybe they're a little bit less subtle, but I can endorse this movie. Honestly, I'm a little surprised, both that it hasn't gotten a little bit more attention because of how strange it is, that it's not more widely known as a cult movie, and that among the people who have seen it, that it's rated so low. Yes, I know the tone and the concept is bewildering, but I don't know. I think you can probably still appreciate the movie. They kind of get past that really quickly, and then you're watching what is really a pretty interesting movie. So, like I said, I would recommend Max, my love, even if it isn't quite at the peak of Oshima's powers in some ways. Like I said, I don't think it's because the concept is too weird. I don't think it's because it's too light. I think it just happens to not quite have been executed as well as some of his other films.